Week 18 is now over in the NFL, and that means the regular season is now done. Of course, the season itself is not done. There's still playoffs, and there's still a lot of football to be played. But for many teams, they now head into the offseason with a number of questions they have to answer. Still, that's a topic for another time. We, of course, have one more set of games to break down here, and break them down we will. This is the Sports Ball Network, and this is our NFL Week 18 breakdown. Things kicked off Saturday afternoon in the NFL in a classic divisional matchup between the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Baltimore Ravens, and it was Pittsburgh who came out on top on this one 17 to 10. For Baltimore, this game did not mean much. They were resting most of their starters as they had clinched the number one seed and wanted to give them some rest. Tyler Huntley got the start at quarterback. He threw for 146 yards and a touchdown. Gus Edwards at running back ran for 48 yards. Tyler Huntley also added in 40 yards on 8 carries of his own. Nelson Aguilar led the receiving room, 5 receptions for 39 yards. The defense had 3 sacks. And overall, for Baltimore, this was just a game that they were not really taking seriously. They had the number one seed, they were resting everyone. And now going into the playoffs, they'll give their starters an extra week of rest as they prepare for their potential opponents. For Pittsburgh, on the other hand, this game meant everything, and they delivered. Mason Rudolph got the start at quarterback. He threw for 152 yards and a touchdown. Something of note, he only had 2 incompletions. He was not asked to do much. Najee Harris ran for 112 yards and a touchdown on the ground. Deontay Johnson led the receivers, 4 for 89 yards and a touchdown in the air. The defense, 4 sacks, including 2 from superstar TJ Watt. And because they won this game and Jacksonville ended up losing, Pittsburgh is now the 7th seed in the AFC. Their prize for this? Playing the Buffalo Bills in frigid winter conditions in Buffalo. Without star rusher TJ Watt, who suffered a knee injury in this game, and with Mason Rudolph as the starting quarterback. Saturday night had another big time game in the sense of the playoff picture in the AFC. The Texans taking on the Colts in a win and in, losing go home situation. And it was Houston who ended up winning this game 23 to 19. The Texans gave this one everything they could and came out on top in no small part because of rookie phenom CJ Stroud, who threw for 264 yards and 2 touchdowns. He was phenomenal, ran for another 20 as well. Devin Singletary on the ground contributed another 63 yards and a touchdown. Nico Collins, 9 receptions, 195 yards and a touchdown. The defense, of course, chipped in as well with a crucial sack and ultimately stopping the Colts from coming back in this game. And because the Jacksonville Jaguars lost to Tennessee, more on that later, it's the Houston Texans who are your AFC South champions. Now, Houston going into the playoffs gets a Browns team in the wild card round. Certainly be a tough out. Indianapolis, meanwhile, falls to 9-8, and because of how things shook out, ended up missing out on the playoffs. Gardner Minshew was not able to get it done. He had 141 yards through the air. Jonathan Taylor, though, was great on the ground, 188 yards and a touchdown on 30 carries for him. The wide receivers did not get much in this game. Josh Downs, 3 receptions, 48 yards. Michael Pittman, 5 receptions, 44 yards. The defense, of course, was not able to do enough despite the fact that they had 2 sacks. And now, going into the offseason, Indianapolis is going to have a couple questions. Are they going to pay star wide receiver Michael Pittman? How's Anthony Richardson going to look in his return from injury? What else can the Colts do to bring in more talent on this team? If they're able to answer them, they most certainly will be competing in the AFC South next year. But if not, things could be rough for them in 2024. There was another AFC North clash to kick things off Sunday afternoon as the Cleveland Browns took on the Cincinnati Bengals in a game that was ultimately meaningless for Cleveland. Cincinnati did win 31 to 14, moving to 9-8 on the season. We'll talk about them more in a minute. But for Cleveland at 11-6, they did not have anything on the line here. They were locked into the 5 seed. And because of that, they started Jeff Driscoll at quarterback, who threw for 166 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions. Pierre Strong at running back added in 65 yards on the ground. David Bell was the leading wide receiver for Cleveland, 4 receptions for 68 yards and those 2 touchdowns. And on defense, the Browns had an interception and 2 sacks. Cleveland now has to travel to Houston to play on the road against a great young team and will have their work cut out for them. But at the same time, Cleveland is a great young team themselves. So I wouldn't be shocked if they end up pulling that out and going on a bit of a playoff run here. For Cincinnati, meanwhile, they moved to 9-8 on the season. They finished things on a high note with a winning record. Jake Browning at quarterback, 156 yards, 3 touchdowns, and an interception. He was great. Joe Mixon, 111 yards and a touchdown on the ground in what could be his Cincinnati finale. He was also phenomenal. Charlie Jones led the wide receiver room with 3 receptions for 49 yards. And the defense, of course, chipped in, adding in 2 interceptions and 3 sacks of their own. Cincinnati would have won certain divisions this year, specifically the NFC South, with the way they played. But because they're in the AFC North, a 9-8 record, a winning record, mind you, put them in last place. Come 2024, I fully expect this team to be competitive, with Joe Burrow coming back and Jamar Chase returning back to full strength as well. But they do have a couple questions to answer, mainly with T. Higgins. Are they going to keep him? Are they going to let him go? And how are they going to continue to improve an offensive line and defense that needs more young talent? If Cincinnati is able to answer some of these, they will be competitive. But if not, we could see more of the same that we saw this year with this team. The Detroit Lions ended up beating the Minnesota Vikings in their season finale 30-20. But of course, that's not what we're talking about in this game, because star tight end Sam Laporta ended up having a knee injury, leaving the game. And now his question is in doubt for Detroit's first home playoff game in 30 years. The Lions, led by Jared Goff, put on a clinic on offense. Goff threw for 320 yards and 2 touchdowns. David Montgomery rushed for 40 and a touchdown. Jahmyr Gibbs ran for 30 and another touchdown. Amon-Ra St. Brown had 7 receptions for 144 yards and a touchdown. And Sam Laporta, 5 receptions for 29 yards and a touchdown. Of course, that doesn't matter. The Sam Laporta injury could be devastating. We'll see on that. But Detroit overall played a great game. The defense also added in 2 interceptions and 4 sacks. And they look to be in pretty good shape going into a pivotal home playoff matchup against their former quarterback and potential future Hall of Famer, Matthew Stafford, and his Los Angeles Rams. Minnesota, meanwhile, fell to 7-10. They have a number of questions to address in the offseason. Quarterback Nick Mullins threw for 396 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions in what was likely his final game as Minnesota's starter this year. Ty Chandler on the ground added in 69 yards on 12 carries. Justin Jefferson was phenomenal. 12 receptions, 192 yards, and a touchdown for him. Defense, of course, added in a sack. But for Minnesota, the big question here is a quarterback. Are they going to keep Kirk Cousins? Or are they going to potentially go in a younger direction? Their answer to that is going to dictate what this team is for the next couple of years and whether or not they will be competitive or not in a softer NFC conference. The Jacksonville Jaguars. Wow. I don't know what to say here. They lost to Tennessee 28-20. Jacksonville missed the playoffs. They went 1-5 over their final 6 games. At one point, they were the number 1 seed. And to see them collapse like this, shocking. Now they head into the offseason with a ton of questions and not a lot of answers. Is Trevor Lawrence, who threw for 280 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions in this game, the franchise savior that people thought he was? Or does he need more talent around him? Is Doug Peterson on the hot seat? He could be if Jacksonville starts off poorly next year or collapses once again. And what is going to happen with Calvin Ridley? He had a great game to end the season, 6 receptions, 106 yards, and a touchdown, and will likely command a huge contract. Is Jacksonville willing to pay that? Because if they do, then they'll have to give Atlanta the second round pick. What this team does in the offseason could have major ramifications for them down the line. So they really, really need to be careful here. For Tennessee, meanwhile, it was kind of a finale of sorts for several of their stars. Derrick Henry ran for 153 yards and a touchdown in what was likely his last game in Tennessee. Ryan Tannehill threw for 168 yards, 2 touchdowns, and an interception in what was likely his last game in Tennessee. DeAndre Hopkins could be out as well. 7 receptions, 46 yards, and a touchdown for him. But most shocking of all for this Tennessee Titans squad as they head into the offseason is that they're going to be looking for a new head coach. This was Mike Vrabel's final game as Tennessee's head coach, and it's a shocker for sure. And while I can maybe see some logic behind firing Mike Vrabel, you want to get younger, more offensive oriented, et cetera, that doesn't mean it was a good one. And now you have this team which has kind of this changing of the guard going on and entering an offseason that's crucial for them without real veteran leadership to help guide them through it. Uh, to me, it just really seems like this Titans team is going through a lot of major changes, a lot of transitions, and honestly, I'm not sure what they're going to be come next year, or really for the next few years. I guess only time will tell on that one. Was this Bill Belichick's final game as a New England Patriot? If it was, it wasn't a great one to go out on, as the New York Jets beat the New England Patriots, snapping their 15-game losing streak to the franchise 17-3. New England did not have a very good game, of course. Bailey Zappi threw for 88 yards and 2 interceptions. Ezekiel Elliott only ran for 54 yards on the ground. Jalen Reagor was the leading receiver with 1 reception for 33 yards. The defense only had a single sack. And really, there are a lot of questions for this Patriots team going into 2024. Sure, they have the third overall pick and they're probably going to select a quarterback, but who's going to be the guy coaching them? Is it going to be Mike Vrabel? Is it going to be Bill Belichick? Who knows? Who's going to be the offensive coordinator for New England? Is it still Bill O'Brien, or do they bring in some fresh new ideas and some fresh blood into the organization? Ultimately, only time will tell on this one, but it really does feel like the end of an era up in New England. For the Jets, meanwhile, they end their season on a high note. Trevor Siemian threw for 70 yards, no touchdowns, no interceptions, but he didn't really need to do much because Breece Hall had another amazing game. 37 carries for him for 178 yards and a touchdown, to go along with 2 receptions for 12 yards. He's just phenomenal. Garrett Wilson had 2 receptions, 34 yards. The defense, of course, 2 interceptions, 7 sacks. And the Jets really give themselves a lot of momentum going into 2024. They'll get Aaron Rodgers back. They'll add more talent on the offensive line and overall on the team through the draft. And if things break right for these Jets, they could be in the playoff conversation next year. Of course, if things go wrong, they could be setting themselves back a few years. But let's not think about that right now. The New Orleans Saints, to absolutely no one's surprise, beat the brakes off of the Atlanta Falcons in a 48-17 rout that has quite a bit of drama surrounding it. Derek Carr was great in this game, 264 yards and 4 touchdowns for him. Kendre Miller, filling in for the injured Alvin Kamara, had 73 yards and a touchdown. Jamal Williams also ran for his first rushing touchdown as a Saint. More on that in a second. And Rashid Shaheed had 3 receptions for 65 yards and a touchdown. Chris Olave, 3 receptions, 55 yards and a touchdown. A.T. Perry, 3 receptions, 53 yards, 2 touchdowns. Just a great game for the Saints. The defense also had an interception. And yeah, this was a masterclass by New Orleans. But that's not what people are talking about here for this game. They're instead talking about the apparent locker room mutiny going on, led by quarterback Jameis Winston, of all people. For those who do not know, Coach Dennis Allen at the end of the game called for a victory formation kneel down, but instead of kneeing the ball and ending the game with no problems, Jameis Winston instead decided to ignore Dennis Allen and hand the ball off to Jamal Williams to get him his first touchdown as a Saint. I'm not going to really comment too much on this or really give my opinion on what I think about all of the conduct going on in this game, but I will say this. The fact that the players just thought it was okay to ignore the head coach really speaks volumes to the amount of respect Dennis Allen has right now in his locker room. And I'm honestly shocked that he's not fired at this point. Then again, I'm also shocked Jameis Winston has not faced any sort of discipline or has been cut from the team, but that's for another day. The point is, New Orleans, despite everything going on, is keeping their head coach for 2024. And because of that, will become must watch TV for the drama alone. Atlanta, meanwhile, is not keeping their head coach to no one's surprise as well. Arthur Smith is fired. So, fantasy football players, rejoice. In addition to the changes at head coach that Atlanta has made, they might also make some changes at quarterback. We'll see. In this game, Desmond Ridder actually looked pretty good. 291 yards, 2 touchdowns, and an interception for him. Running back Bijan Robinson added 28 yards on the ground in addition to 103 yards on 7 receptions. In the air, he also had a touchdown reception for 71 yards. It was awesome. But Atlanta is going to have a number of questions to answer in the offseason. They had a ton of expectations going into this season. They looked like they could have won the division, but of course they didn't. And going into 2024, if they're going to want to get back to the top of the NFC South, they're going to have to come up with some major answers and some major changes from what they've done this year. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers mercifully ended the Carolina Panthers season this Sunday as well in a 9-0 victory, which saw them clinch the NFC South. Tampa Bay did not play a very good game here. Baker Mayfield threw for 137 yards. Rashad White ran for 75 yards. Chris Godwin was the leading receiver, 6 receptions, 51 yards for him. The defense, 3 sacks. But they did enough. And now, because they won the NFC South, they get to host a floundering Eagles team, which looks very much like they could win that game. So that's certainly something. If they do win that game, they are likely to then play the juggernaut of the NFC in the San Francisco 49ers. But it's the playoffs, so anything can happen there. I will say this, though. Tampa was the best team in the NFC South. It's a good thing they won the division. I really did not want to see the Arthur Smith-led Atlanta Falcons or the Dennis Allen-led New Orleans Saints in the playoffs. So for that, Baker Mayfield, I thank you. The Carolina Panthers, meanwhile, man, where do I start with this? Threw for 94 yards. He's got a ton of questions going into year 2. He's already looking like a potential generational quarterback bust. So he's going to have to really step it up next year in order to kind of get rid of that narrative surrounding him. Chuba Hubbard was a bright spot on this team. He had 83 yards on 23 carries at the running back position. He may be back as a starter next year. We'll see there. DJ Chark was the leading receiver, 2 receptions, 46 yards. Nobody else had over 15 yards receiving. Carolina's going to need to really revamp that room. But with what draft capital and what free agency acquisitions, I don't know. Carolina, of course, traded away the number 1 overall pick to the Chicago Bears. They don't have that anymore to help them in this rebuild. Carolina is not a desirable free agent destination. The ownership is a mess. The team is a mess. And because they don't really have any assets to fix that with, I fully expect more of the same down in Carolina in 2024. Did you guys know that the last time the Chicago Bears beat the Green Bay Packers, it was week 15 in the 2018 season? That's just pathetic. And that streak, of course, continued this past Sunday as the Green Bay Packers clinched the final playoff spot in the NFC with their 17-19 victory over Chicago. Green Bay has been hot as of late, led by quarterback Jordan Love, who has seemingly taken a star turn. He threw for 316 yards and 2 touchdowns. Aaron Jones on the ground contributed as well. adding in 111 yards on 22 carries. Rookie wide receiver Jaden Reed added in 4 receptions for 112 yards. The defense, of course, had 5 sacks. And Green Bay, heading into the playoffs, has a ton of momentum and will absolutely be a tough out for Dallas, who plays them in Jerry World. For Chicago, meanwhile, they enter the offseason with a ton of questions, but unlike the Carolina Panthers, a ton of assets to fix them with. They have fired Luke Getzey, their offensive coordinator, but they have not fired head coach Matt Eberflus. He seems to be safe for now. So it will be him who determines the future of quarterback Justin Fields. Fields, in what could have been his final game in Chicago, threw for 148 yards and ran for 27 more. He might be traded. He might be kept. We don't know. We'll see. Khalil Herbert, starting running back, ran for only 28 yards. The Bears might look to add another piece there as well. DJ Moore, 4 receptions, 64 yards. Cole Kmet, 3 receptions, 41 yards. I would presume the team will look to get them some help as well to alleviate some of the pressure being placed on them as the top 2 playmakers on the offense. The defense, of course, only had a single sack, but looks to potentially be a top 10 unit next year, provided they add 1 or 2 more guys. And with the #1 overall pick, their own draft pick, and a ton of financial capital, I believe that Chicago, if they have a good offseason, can absolutely be a competitive team in 2024. Time will tell, of course, on what happens at the quarterback position. But overall, the Bears look to be in a pretty good spot heading into the off season. No one's really going to talk about it as much as the Chicago losing streak to the Green Bay Packers. But the fact that the Denver Broncos have not beaten the Raiders since they left Oakland is almost just as bad. Denver once again lost to the Raiders this week, 27-14, to finish their season at 8-9. And this Broncos team has a ton of questions and not a lot of answers right now going into the offseason. Starting with their quarterback situation. Who is going to be the starter? Is it going to be Jarrett Stidham, who threw for 272 yards, a touchdown, and an interception in this game? Or is it going to be someone else? Is Javonte Williams, who ran for 32 yards and a touchdown in this game, the starting running back next year? Or will they bring in some help? And who's going to complement Cortland Sutton, who left this game with an injury, wide receiver? Will it be Brandon Johnson, who led the team this week with 4 receptions for 88 yards? Could it still perhaps be Jerry Jeudy, who had 3 receptions for 79 yards and a touchdown? Or will it be someone else? And let's, of course, not forget about the defense, which has improved, but still needs some help going into 2024. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens in Mile High. But of course, if things improve, Denver could be competitive in a tough AFC, in a tough AFC West. But if not, could we perhaps see Sean Payton on the hot seat? Meanwhile, for the Raiders, they finish at 8-9 and they end things on a high note as interim coach Antonio Pierce, in my eyes, has more than earned a shot to be the full-time coach of this team. Aiden O'Connell also has earned a shot to be the quarterback of this team. He was great this week, throwing for 244 yards and 2 touchdowns. Zamir White could perhaps see more work at running back. He had 112 yards on 25 carries this week. And at wide receiver, there seems to be a changing of the guard as Davante Adams, who had 5 receptions for 46 yards, could be on his way out. Meanwhile, guys like Jacoby Myers, 3 receptions, 61 yards and a touchdown. Michael Mayer and Trey Tucker, who had 5 receptions for 79 yards, could see more of a role. The Raiders in 2024 are obviously going to see a number of changes in terms of youth, in terms of players, and potentially in terms of the coach. But so long as they play like they have been over the past few weeks, particularly the defense, which added another 5 sacks and an interception in this game, they absolutely will be a competitive force in the AFC come 2024. I really do not want to talk about this absolute catastrophe of a game. But because we are doing a weekly recap and recapping all of the games in the NFL, I am forced to. For those who do not know, I root for the Philadelphia Eagles, and once again, I was disappointed this week in what was a 27-10 embarrassment against the New York Giants. Really, this game was so bad for Philadelphia that I don't even want to go over the stat sheet, but I shall. Jalen Hurts threw for 55 yards and an interception and was benched by halftime. Granted, he had a finger injury, but still, that's not acceptable. The ground game, though, did something. Kenneth Gainwell ran for 62 yards, and Marcus Mariota, starting at quarterback from the second half onward, ran for 46 as well. The receivers, on the other hand, mostly struggled. Quez Watkins had 8 receptions for 93 yards and a touchdown. A.J. Brown got hurt. Just I'm grateful that it's not an ACL or an MCL tear. Hopefully he recovers soon, gets better. The defense was the defense of the Philadelphia Eagles, so it was non-existent. And yeah, this game was a catastrophe. Rookie safety Sidney Brown tore his ACL. The Eagles lost their 5th game in the past 6 weeks, and now heading into the wild card week and a matchup with Tampa Bay, there's some real concerns that this team could lose. And if they do, you better believe that there will be an absolute purge of the coaching staff, potentially all the way through the head coach. The Giants, meanwhile, end their season on a positive note, unfortunately. Tyrod Taylor was fantastic in this game, 297 yards, a touchdown, and an interception. Saquon ran for 2 touchdowns and 46 yards. Wan'Dale Robinson, 5 receptions, 85 yards. Darius Slayton, 5 receptions, 62 yards, and a touchdown. The defense, of course, just manhandled the Eagles all game long. 2 interceptions, 5 sacks. And yeah, the Giants entered the offseason with some questions, namely, what are they going to do with Daniel Jones and his contract? If I had to guess, they will eat it for one more year and then cut him in 2025. The G-men are also looking for a new defensive coordinator after the whole Wink Martindale situation that's been going on the past couple days. But overall, the Giants enter the offseason with a lot of momentum. And if they make a few good moves, add a few good players, and draft well, they absolutely could compete in the NFC come next year. The Seattle Seahawks won 21-20 in their final game of the season over the Arizona Cardinals this past Sunday afternoon. And this game took on a lot more meaning after it was played. That's because legendary head coach Pete Carroll has been relieved of his head coaching duties. Don't worry, Seahawks fans, he will still be an advisor for the team, but this is clearly the end of an era. So much so that the team has told all of the other coach and staff that they should be looking for other jobs. Seattle's going to be entering 2024 looking to completely tear down their organization and start from the root up. Geno Smith may not be the quarterback next year, but he did have a good send off, 189 yards and 2 touchdowns for him. Kenneth Walker, running back, ran for 78 yards. Tyler Lockett could have played his final game as a Seahawk. He ended that with 2 receptions for 71 yards and a touchdown. The defense added in a sack as well. But really, stuff on the field didn't matter as much as the aftermath. And now 2024 is going to be a year in which Seattle is going to look to retool, rebuild, and reload so they can compete in the long-term future. Arizona, meanwhile, ends their season on a high note despite the loss. They fought until the end and very nearly could have won if Matt Prater had not missed his field goal in the final seconds of the game. Kyler Murray will be back next year at quarterback, 262 yards and a touchdown for him. James Conner was fantastic on the ground, 150 yards and a touchdown on 27 carries. Michael Wilson led the receivers here, 6 receptions, 95 yards for him. And overall, this game was just good for the Cardinals. It really helped establish that they're a team that's going to fight for every single yard, every single point for all 60 minutes. Now, 2024, they'll have a lot of premium draft capital, a lot of money in free agency, and an emerging culture. So things could perhaps turn around for them as soon as next year. Kansas City Chiefs, with their playoff spot secured, elected to rest most of their starters in their final regular season game against the Los Angeles Chargers. That ultimately didn't matter. Kansas City won 13-12. Blaine Gabbert threw for 154 yards and an interception. Lamarco Perrine led the running backs with 76 yards. Mecole Hardman, 6 receptions, 77 yards. The defense, of course, was great, 3 sacks. And now, going into next week, Kansas City gets a Miami team that struggles in the cold. And guess what, guys? The forecast in Arrowhead is set to be one of the coldest in history. The Chargers, meanwhile, end their season at 5-12. Easton Stick struggled at quarterback, 258 yards. Of course, he took those 3 sacks as well. He did, however, lead the team in rushing, 77 yards on the ground for him. Austin Eckler, meanwhile, vanished, 11 yards on 10 carries for him. Who knows what's going to happen with him and his future on this team? Donald Parham Jr. Led the receivers, 5 receptions, 83 yards. Joshua Palmer, 6 receptions, 44 yards. And overall for LA, this game showed that a lot of things need to change. And I would imagine they would in 2024. Keenan Allen turns 32 and he could be gone. Mike Williams turns 30. He tore his ACL. He also could be gone. The defense is aging up a bit and the team needs a new head coach. So until they solve some of these issues and chart a path forward, I can't really imagine the Chargers competing. Then again, they also have star quarterback Justin Herbert, who will return from injury. So who knows? Perhaps 2024 could be better for LA. But chances are, with so many holes and so many questions on the roster, they will more than likely struggle. The LA Rams took on the San Francisco 49ers in another meaningless Week 18 game that saw LA win 21-20. LA clinched their playoff spot. They were either going to be the 6th or the 7th seed, depending on whether or not they won or lost. Ultimately, it didn't really matter. They were going to play a tough team either way. They just so happened to win. Matthew Stafford and most of the starters rested in this game, but Carson Wentz played great. 163 yards, 2 touchdowns, and an interception for him to go along with 56 yards and a touchdown on the ground. He pretty much dominated all game long against San Francisco's backups. Ronnie Rivers, 152 yards on the ground as well. Bryson Hopkins, 2 receptions, 47 yards. Puka Nacua, 4 receptions, 41 yards, and a touchdown. And now LA, as the 6th seed, goes to play Detroit in what seems to be a matchup of destiny as Matthew Stafford returns to where it began. That should more than be a fun one. San Francisco, meanwhile, had the 1 seed clinched. They rested most of their starters. Sam Darnold threw 189 yards and a touchdown in the air. Elijah Mitchell, 52 yards and a touchdown on the ground. Chris Conley, 3 receptions, 69 yards. And now San Francisco has a week of rest, and they'll need it to game plan as well as they could be playing a pretty tough opponent in the NFC divisional round. The Dallas Cowboys ended up beating the Washington Commanders 38-10 in order to clinch the number 2 seed in the NFC East title. And Dallas was just great in this game. Dak, 279 yards, 4 touchdowns, and an interception. He's had an MVP season, guys, and he won't win the MVP, but I just want to put it out there. He's been phenomenal. Tony Pollard, 70 yards and a touchdown on the ground for him. CeeDee Lamb was great. 13 receptions for 98 yards and 2 touchdowns. Jake Ferguson had 6 receptions, 69 yards. The defense, of course, was dominant. 4 sacks, 2 interceptions. There's really not much to say about Dallas. They are just really good. They look really good. And now, in round 1 of the playoffs, they get to play a very inexperienced Green Bay Packers team in what is the Mike McCarthy revenge game. Washington, meanwhile, clinches the number 2 overall pick. One would assume they're going to use that on a quarterback. Sam Howell, in what could have been his final start of the season, threw for 153 yards, a touchdown, 2 interceptions, and also made a little bit of history as he was the first Washington quarterback to start every game of a season since Kirk Cousins back in the early 2010s. Brian Robinson at running back added another 25 yards on the ground. Terry McLaurin, 6 receptions, 56 yards. The defense added in an interception for good measure as well. But ultimately, Washington's focus here was not on this year, it's on 2024. They have fired their head coach, Ron Rivera, to no one's surprise. Everyone knew that he was gone by the end of the year since like week 10. And now, with the second overall pick, new ownership, which is bringing in a lot of different consultants to help build the team up, and a ton of capital to work with, Washington's future looks bright. Maybe they won't be great in 2024, but certainly they'll be getting on the path towards it. Sunday night saw an absolute classic played in Miami as the Buffalo Bills stormed back to take the AFC East title in a 21-14 thriller. Josh Allen did his usual thing. He threw a couple interceptions, threw a couple touchdowns, just made absolute ridiculous plays all game long. He had 359 yards, two touchdowns, two interceptions in the air, 67 on the ground. He was just phenomenal. There's really no other way to put it. Uh, Ignore the interceptions for a second. He just did absolutely everything for this team, and he's probably the main reason why they won this game. James Cook, 36 yards on the ground. Khalil Shakir, 6 receptions, 105 yards. Stephon Diggs, back on track, 7 receptions, 87 yards. Dalton Kincaid, also back on track here, 7 receptions, 84 yards for him. Their defense came up clutch, 2 interceptions. And it wasn't pretty for Buffalo, but hey, they won the division, and now they're the number 2 seed. And because of that, they get a date with the Pittsburgh Steelers come wild card weekend. Miami, meanwhile, collapsed down the stretch, and as a result, they end up as the number 6 seed. They have to travel to Kansas City and play in what is likely to be frozen conditions. Not great for them considering their track record in cold weather games. Tua struggled in this one, 173 yards, a touchdown, 2 interceptions. Devon Chan led the way on the ground, 56 yards and a touchdown for him. Tyreek Hill in the air, 7 receptions, 82 yards and a touchdown. The defense for Miami, 2 interceptions, 3 sacks. But ultimately, the effort was not enough. And now, because of that, they have to travel on the road and play in a hostile environment. And should they lose, we'll have to face a number of questions going into the offseason, both at quarterback and potentially at coach. Of course, Miami could end up winning that wild card game and going on quite a bit of a run. They have it in them. But considering their track record, I wouldn't count on that. Because of that, they will likely enter the offseason with a lot more questions than answers for this team. And there we have it, the final weekly recap of the 2023 NFL season. Just want to thank everybody for supporting the channel as we continue to grow and as we put out these videos. It's been a wild ride. It's been really fun. And I'm looking forward to providing you guys a whole lot of great new football content in 2024. So if you like what you saw, leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, and as always, we'll catch you in the next one.